Hello, everyone. Welcome. You've all got to the right place. This is the forward. You're all in the right place. We're going to begin momentarily. So as people filter in. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rob Eshman. I'm the national editor of The Forward, and I'm looking forward to this conversation on anti-Semitism and hate crime in Los Angeles and how government officials and residents can come together and stop it. I want to thank a special thanks to LA City Controller Ron Galperin for initiating this conversation, to his staff, and to the team at The Forward for putting it all together. You'll all be getting a subscription offer to The Forward, which the New York Times just correctly called America's most important and prominent Jewish newspaper, in tomorrow's email. After very brief introductions of the speakers, we're going to go right into questions. If you have a question, you could put it down below in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll get time to address it later. So I want to welcome our panelists. LA City Controller Ron Galperin, Serena Oberstein, Executive Director of Jewish World Watch, Gamal Palmer, Principal and Founder of Conscious Builder, and Jeffrey Abrams, Regional Director of ADL Los Angeles. Welcome all. Jeffrey, why don't we start with you? In 2020, the Anti-Defamation League tabulated 2,024 reported anti-Semitic incidents throughout the United States. A 4% decrease from 2019, but still the third highest year on record since the ADL started tracking anti-Semitic incidents in 1979. Maybe we'll start. I wanted to get kind of the overview. Could you quickly break down these numbers? What kinds of incidents, virtual, real life? Go.
Rob, thank you so much. Thank you in The Forward, Controller Galperin. Thank you and my fellow panelists. So I want to give context to this information and from the very start to understand the distinction between what we at ADL do, which is we track anti-Semitic incidents, and hate crimes, which we'll talk about a little bit, which the FBI tracks and reports, so does LA County. Now, incidents are really in three categories: assaults, vandalism, and harassment. Now, as you mentioned, Rob, last year was the third highest number of incidents in the history of our annual audit. We've done this since 1979. And what this enables us to do is to identify trend lines. So for example, last year was a slight decrease from the prior year, but there was a 10% increase in harassment. Why? Well, we were all inside in 2020. And so what happens is hate, anti-Semitism metastasized. And so in 2020, there was a 10% increase of harassment online, things like Zoom bombing. But also, and just a couple last points in terms of timing. So we're here and we're talking about our reporting from 2020. ADL releases our annual audit information in April, the FBI in October, LA County just this past November. So as we're talking about these numbers, keep in mind we're really talking about 2020 data. And just to end with 2021. Now, the year isn't finished and our work is not complete, but what we've seen with our own eyes is supported by the statistics. From May 11th through the end of the month, during the conflict between Israel and Hamas, there was 115% year-to-year comparison in the number of anti-Semitic incidents that took place. And here in Los Angeles, on our streets, we saw physical assaults. We saw a group of Persian diners assaulted on Los Angeles Boulevard by a caravan that pulled up and demanded who's a Jew. The night before, we saw a visibly Orthodox man chased through a parking lot by what may be those same cars. And then a week later, 2 boys walking through Hancock Park with seat. They were shot with paint guns. So the statistics are not yet in, but 2021 certainly felt and was a year when a lot of American Jews and a lot of Jews in Los Angeles were under assault.
Ron, Jeffrey just referred to the LA County statistics, which recently came out. The Forward just had a story about them. It showed a stark increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans in Los Angeles and Blacks in Los Angeles. It did show a 20% decrease in anti-Semitic attacks in Los Angeles, but the headline here seems to be this real spike in hate crime, anti-Semitic or not, increasing in LA. How do you explain that happening in our city?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you so very much, Rob, for putting this together. And what an amazing group of panelists have been assembled here. I remember as a little boy, every single day that my grandfather would have delivered the Yiddish Daily Forward, and it was his lifeline to knowing what was happening in the world, since it was his primary language. And to see how the Forward has blossomed and reinvented itself for the 21st century is really incredibly gratifying. But absolutely.
And just to be clear, we're in English now.
Yes, exactly, in English, yes.
Okay.
But we have absolutely seen an increase in incidents. Part of that is because of an increase in reporting, but a lot of it is because there's just more to report. And there are many different agencies and entities that collect this information: ADL, LAPD, the county, FBI, but all of them really show the same thing. And let's be frank, the stats don't really tell you the full picture. There's no real stat, for example, on how many observant Jews chose to not wear a yarmulke in public for fear of what might happen. There's no real stat on the number of LGBTQ people who remain closeted because of the backlash that they know will happen in their communities and sometimes their own families. There's no real stat on the jobs and promotions that many members of the Black community didn't get because of latent or blatant racism. There's no real stat on the many looks askance that Muslim men and women get when they're in traditional garb and just walking down the street. And then there's no stat on the umpteen number of times religious leaders and the respective pulpits misquote the Torah or the New Testament or the Quran to condemn homosexuality or something else. As the son of a Holocaust survivor and as a Jew, as a gay man in Los Angeles, I am very concerned by this increase that we've seen. And certainly COVID has contributed to it. Social media has contributed to it. Leaders nationally and internationally who really stoke this kind of hatred instead of tamping it down and instead of setting the right kind of example have contributed to it. And it's, I think, an obligation on all of our parts. And that's why I'm so happy we're coming together in this context to really work together, many different communities, because an attack on one is an attack on all when all is said and done. And we have an obligation to care one for the other. And that is, I think, the greatest lesson that we can learn.
Thank you, Ron. Gamal, Ron spoke about the workplace, and he talked, if we go away from kind of the stats and more into the, the day-to-day lived experience. You worked at the Jewish Federation for many years. How much was anti-Semitism a concern within just kind of your workplace, going to work every morning, but also within the larger organized community?
Hello. Good morning, everyone. Not morning. Good afternoon. I'm like, can I speak? And also, do I know what time it is? Gamal, it's really great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's a real honor to be with my colleagues here today. So what I think a concern is, and what we really need to be concerned about within the Jewish community, is how can we still simultaneously address anti-Semitism and also be allies for our other communities, for the Black community, for the Asian community, for the Muslim community. There's just so much division right now, even within the Jewish community, and there's so much polarization, whether you're talking about it from a political standpoint or an observance, standpoint, Israel, and the opportunity to have discourse and to even for the community internally to unpack what sort of anti-Semitism exists within the Jewish community is really troubling to me. And, we're people who pride ourselves on really celebrating different perspectives and allowing for different gifts to be brought into the tent, if you will. That's something that, I talk about a lot in my work when I work with organizations in diversity inclusion sort of context is, the Mishkan and God said, like every tribe can bring in their own gift. And that's something to be into the tent. And that's something to be celebrated. And so what concerns me is this division that we have and cancel culture that we have within the community that is actually dividing us and not allowing us to address anti-Semitism externally, right? And it's not allowing us to be allies to our neighbors that, that also, need support as well. So I think that's a place that we really need to look.
I want to get back a little bit. I do want to get back to that, especially when we go into what are the possible solutions here. And I think allyship that you touched on, Gamal, is so important. Serena, it's really a pleasure to have you here, partly because in your day-to-day work, you're dealing with genocide and hate around the world with Jewish World Watch. And I just wonder, and I think that gives you a very interesting perspective. I think your antenna must be very sharp for where you see hate coming up in society. So I wondered if your antenna are sharpened living in LA, if you feel there's more of an atmosphere of hate, where you see the danger signs that would lead to these kind of statistical increases.
Thanks so much, Rob. And thank you to the controller for pulling this together. I'm really grateful to be a part of this conversation. Look, I think in Jewish World Watch, as you mentioned, we were founded in 2004 to combat silence and inaction around genocide in Darfur. And today we exist 17 years later, almost 18 years, because genocide and mass atrocities have never been more rampant. We know that these things don't happen in a bubble. I think in this country, many of us point to the events of Charlottesville or the Tree of Life, or here in LA, we look at the incident at the North Valley JCC as this sort of moment that renewed our hypervigilance or awareness or fear as Jews living in today. But I would say that so much of that is within the Ashkenazi Jewish community. I think Gamal and the controller really brought up something important, which is that it's a privilege that as Ashkenazi Jews, unless we are walking around with a yarmulke, unless we are taking a moment and saying, well, maybe I'm not going to wear my Star of David today, that we're able to pass and assimilate. Whereas I would assert that members of the Jewish community who are Jews of color or non-Jews never ever stopped that hypervigilance. They always had that awareness. I'll say that in our day-to-day work, when we're serving as ambassadors and conveners in the non-Jewish community, whether it's with the Uyghur community or the Rohingya community, which are both ethnically Muslim, the Congolese community or the Armenian, we're always met with open arms. And when there have been anti-Semitic incidents like last summer, we heard directly from most, if not all of them, telling us first, they know what we're going through, right? That this is like their day-to-day and that we're not alone. And two, they asked us how we could help. So I would say that from our perspective, the coalitions that we're creating are combating the incidents of anti-Semitism, and I feel like we're moving in a better direction and that there's a lot more work to do.
I want to get a little bit to causes. Ron, I'll start maybe this round with you, but where do you see most of this coming from? Like the not just the anti-Semitism, but also the hate. Is this you know, I don't want to be kind of draw too broad a brush. Is it right wing? Is it, you know, from more of the liberal identitarian communities? I mean, where is this rise in anti-Semitism coming from for these numbers?
Well, regrettably, I see it from the left and I see it from the right and I see it from everything in between. And not just anti-Semitism, but so many of the other forms of hatred that are manifest. When it comes to anti-Semitism, this is nothing new, unfortunately. Jews have endured 2,000 years of hatred, of expulsions, of forced conversions, of pogroms, of forced settlement in ghettos, of refugee status, of mass murder. And it's a hate that has spanned the millennia. And you just see new manifestations of it today. I will say I'm particularly troubled by anti-Semitism that's now rebranded as hatred and delegitimization of Israel. And I don't believe that criticism of Israel or its policies is necessarily a manifestation of anti-Semitism, nor do I always agree with Israeli policy all the time. But I can say I wouldn't be here if Israel didn't exist. It's the place that my father was able to escape the Holocaust and not be murdered when he left Romania in 1943. It was the place that my mother's parents escaped pogroms in Russia to be able to resettle. But we're seeing, I think, a lot of anti-Semitism now manifest as a hatred of Zionism, and even equating Zionism with Nazism in some cases, which is utterly repugnant. And it is now politically correct, in fact, to do that. And I think we have to speak out against this form of anti-Semitism. Perfectly okay to criticize Israel, but we are seeing a lot of anti-Semitism manifest in this way. Look, there has been another excuse in each and every single generation for 2,000 years. And there's also lots of excuses and lots of reasons that you can say that there is hatred against a variety of other groups. But in the final analysis, none of the reasons, none of the causes are at all legitimate. And we have an obligation to essentially shut them down, to educate, to work together, and to not tolerate it.
Jeffrey, you had said that there was a 75% increase in anti-Semitism reports to the ADL during the last Israeli-Palestinian fighting in Gaza. I think it went from 127 incidents in the 2 weeks prior to the fighting to 222 after. And we can, you can't help but agree with the controller that there's no excuse for it. But how do you deal with it? How do we know now? There's plenty of statistics that when there's fighting in Israel, there's going to be an increased danger to Jewish communities around the world and here in LA. How do you deal with it? You're on mute.
Just to be clear, the statistics I mentioned was it was 115 increase year to year from the incidents, just to be clear. But really, it's how do you, one, is it inevitable? It's a question. Let's assume then it is. When these hotspots occur, what happens there, which is unrelated, but has an impact on us here, what is the reaction? And in fact, this past year in many ways was unprecedented because not only do we see the physical attacks on our streets in Los Angeles, but you also saw something very unusual online. And I know we're going to talk about that a little later. And so in that moment, it's incumbent upon people to speak up. If you see something on the street, if you see something online, and this is very consistent with our belief at ADL, you have to speak up. And in doing so, you share the facts. And in doing so, you have to be strong together. But the first thing is, and building a little bit on, I think what Serena said is, there were many allies who stood arm to arm with the Jewish community in May. But there was a feeling from a lot of folks, whether it was business or government, that there wasn't a loud enough voice. And that's, I think, something we should keep talking about, not in where were you in our moment of need, but some of the reasons why we need more allyship. And I think, and I appreciate the conversation we're having tonight about that, but because ultimately it's about allyship.
Gamal, in your work, do you see it as being effective to go into some of these communities where that may have strong feelings when they see what's going on with Israel in the news, or if there's violence in Gaza, and kind of doing education prior, or is by the time it's happening, it is already too late to get a level of understanding and a level of allyship?
I think that for folks who are not connected or a part of the Jewish community, there's just so much that one doesn't know, and they're left up to it's up to assumptions, right? And that's like anything in life. You know, if you don't tell, I mean, my grandma used to say to me, if you don't tell your story, someone will make your story up for you. And we, and I've thought this since a kid, in Hebrew school, and talking about these same issues, which was only yesterday. No, we're talking about, these same issues is, we don't do enough work to really help people understand who we are as a community. Too many people don't understand or don't know. I have many friends who, when I tell them the amount of organizations, Jewish organizations, that are committed to communities that are not Jewish, and specifically do not work with the Jewish community, because there are other organizations who do that, right? When people learn the amount of dollars, right, that people donate to support anti-racism or deconstructing racism, right, to bring folks to support Muslim community, there's a lack of knowledge. And I would say it's the same thing about the history of Israel, and and what Israel is and how it came to be, and efforts even on the ground in Israel, right? That the Israelis who are fighting for a two-state solution, who are fighting for freedom for people. And so there's just a lack of knowledge and understanding. And so we're left up to to what we hear and the feelings that we have about oppression.
Serena, is that your sense? I mean, you're working with so many non-Jew in the non-Jewish world. Is that your sense too? And if so, what do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's made some really valid assertions that we definitely need more allyship, but especially over the last, let's call it 4 to 6 years, we've been so inundated by a pandemic and social unrest and violence at the hands of the state and things breaking. And at the same time Charlottesville was happening, there were 2 genocides, 2 crackdowns against the Uyghurs in China and against the Rohingya in Myanmar, right? So all of this stuff is happening, and how does it break through the noise? I think allyship is critical, that not only asking people to be there for us, but us being there for other people. I would, we were talking about denial and distortion. That's something that Jewish World Watch is talking about a lot with the Armenian community as well, as they continue, just earlier this year, after 106 years, their genocide was finally recognized. And the hate speech that they also endure from the Turkish government and the Azerbaijani government, right? It's Jewish World Watch is there to say the same thing that people were saying to us last summer: you're not alone. And I think by building really authentic relationships where we're showing up for each other, and having transparency, and sharing a meal and getting to know each other and asking about our kids, and that's how you break down these silos. That's how you when something happens again, when there's another anti-Semitic incident, people will be standing with you because you know them, because you have their phone number, because they're in your home. And I think it's only in those ways, when we are starting by saying, hey, what can I do, without expecting anything in return, or will there be some type of reciprocity, if you will?
But it feels like against that, which is super positive, you're fighting this tidal wave of junk on the internet, this digital wave. And it was interesting that so many of the anti-Semitic incidents that are reported are digital. So I have a couple questions about that. Jeffrey, maybe I'll go to you first. What do we do about this problem? Because my sense is that the fear of anti-Semitism is almost out of proportion to the actual incidents, even though the incidents are terrible. And partly that's because we feel anti-Semitism on our iPhone. It's like right in front of our face sometimes. So I'm wondering what we do about that. And Ron, I mean, it's, this is something that a city official could have very little control over because it's happening on the internet. But what can elected leaders do about the hate that we're finding constantly, whether it's Zoom bombing or anything else, or name calling, or going after Jewish journalists or people with a Jewish last name on the internet?
Well, let me first say that you said that you believe that the fear is greater than the incidents. And I'm not sure that that is necessarily true. I think that there are some very legitimate reasons for that fear, even if some of those incidents are not reported. Look, at the front of the Jewish Federation building on Wilshire Boulevard, you've got all of these concrete pillars which are meant to keep somebody from crashing in through the front door. Now, nobody has done that since those pillars are up there, but they're not there for no reason whatsoever. They're there because there's real legitimate concern, even if an incident has not manifested itself. But as to your question about social media, I'm a big believer in free speech. And I also believe that we need to be really careful about how you curb it, because today you may want to curb somebody else's speech and tomorrow they want to curb yours. And we have to be able to tolerate speech that we may find offensive. That said, I think we need really clear guidelines around social media and hate speech, and to require companies to take greater accountability. And I think that, for example, you have the right to write an anti-Semitic treatise, but that doesn't mean that you have a right for the public library to buy that book and to put it on the shelf of the library. You have a right to your opinions, and you have a right to speak your opinions. That doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be handed a megaphone for that. And we've got to really be also proactive in terms of how we post, and getting messages of tolerance out, getting messages of facts out. And by the way, educating not just the community at large and not just all of our allies, but within the Jewish community. I know too many members of the Jewish community themselves who don't really know the richness and diversity of our community, don't know the history of Israel, and of the diversity that exists there as well. So we've got a lot of education to do internally on top of everything else.
We're definitely going to get back to the education question. Jeffrey, is Facebook an ally, as we're using the word here, or are they an opponent in the fight for anti-Semitism? And what do we do about it? How do we keep some of this garbage off our phones?
So let's be clear about a few things. First, the First Amendment has to do with government regulation. And just like the controller said, let's be very, very careful of government regulation of speech. But Facebook is a private company. And Facebook alone has done more to enable the spread of hatred than perhaps any company, any entity in the history of humankind. Now, it's not to say that there aren't some aspects of these social media companies that bring people together. They've done a lot of good in the world. I even harken back to the Arab Spring. But let's look where we are today. So as an example, we at ADL advocated for well over a decade to have Holocaust denial treated as a form of hate speech. A decade. And last summer, we helped organize a Stop Hate for Profit campaign. And so for the month of July, over 1,200 companies paused their advertising on Facebook. It didn't destroy Facebook. But a few weeks later, Facebook's finally treating Holocaust denial as a form of hate speech. Now, are they doing a good job with that promise? No. We saw what happened with the Facebook whistleblower. We've heard about all the information that Facebook and other companies are hiding. We've heard about these transparency reports, which really aren't transparency reports. It's really based to hide information. So here's what we can do. And it's something that is happening right now in the state of California that could have a dramatic impact. There's a currently pending bill in the state legislature, AB 587. Sponsor is Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel, who many know in this crowd. And what it would do, AB 587, would require social media companies to be actually transparent. to report on a quarterly basis to the state attorney general, what are your policies about hate speech? How are you enforcing them? And actually provide the data so we can evaluate the harm that's being caused. Not just the numerator, how many times they took content off, but what's the denominator? What is it as a percentage? And not just in America, but around the world. So there is something that can be done, and I think we need to start doing something. So they're all incremental steps. We have to be very careful. Make no mistake, whatever happens with this bill, when it becomes law, it will be challenged, but it's a step. It's a step in the right direction.
I understand it's a dangerous, you don't want government involved in regulating this speech, but is there something else that it could be done at a city level? Because when you think about it, these things are occurring in our cities. Like, cities are affected. Our police have to deal with the hate, with the outcome of these hateful acts, whether it's vandalism or actual attacks. So is there something cities can do, Ron, that would somehow address this problem?
Well, first of all, on a broad level, when it comes to hate and anti-Semitism, but all forms of hate, in 2020, actually, the mayor issued an executive directive to address racial equity in city government. We've also appointed a chief equity officer, very much committed, much more so than pretty much any other city in America, to issues of racial justice and to reducing hate. We've got a new Department of Civil and Human Rights, which is working within all sorts of different communities, and is also looking at the issue of social media and how that impacts the kind of tenor that we see within the city and around the nation. And I also believe that we have to look at the kind of social media that is sent out by our own city, how we can use these media platforms in a way that actually helps bring people together as elected officials, as departments, as department heads, as commissions, as commissioners, all of those things. We have the ability to use that technology for good, just as it's being misused for bad by others.
I mean, it's crazy how, let me just move my Q&A so I could see you, Serena, on my screen. But it's, if you look at what happened with the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda and how that entire genocide was sparked by media, basically, by what was going on over the radio, now it's even more powerful. Is there something you've learned in your work, Serena, that could go to helping figure out how to address these issues, whether it's through broadcast or through digital media?
Well, I do think that while we don't want the government to regulate our speech, we also know that hateful speech leads to hateful action, right? It's one of the stages of genocide that oftentimes elected and authoritarian regimes use hateful speech to perpetuate propaganda. We saw it in the Holocaust. We're seeing it now in the Uyghurs. They're using basically what I would call mouse cartoons to propagandize, to otherize. And so I think what we can do in the absence of legislation is empower and embolden our leaders in positional power. We can call our elected officials. We can make sure that they know that we don't stand for these things, that they need to be speaking out against it. I mean, we've seen in the new administration, we've seen Secretary Blinken repeatedly on the side of, I would say, the righteous, speaking out against hateful speech and hateful action. And so I think that we have to galvanize as, community leaders and make sure that we are aware of what's happening and speak out against it. If there is legislation, it does become dangerous, but through things like educating ourselves, educating one another, we can hopefully perpetuate less hateful speech.
Gamal, you talked about allyship, but I wonder, when you travel between these different identity communities, so much of hate speech is kind of community specific. It's, we had that experience, I think it was last year, where there were several high profile rappers who said really anti-Semitic things. And then there's anti-Black and and certainly anti-Islamic things being said among Jewish communities. So, I mean, as somebody who kind of traffics between these communities, how do you, if it's taking place kind of, these communities kind of become a bubble unto themselves, how do you break the bubble and get them to say, no, this reads really wrong if you're outside that community?
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess I'm quoting mothers tonight. So I have my former partner, who's Spanish from Spain. His mom used to say to me all the time, Gamal, people talk because they have a mouth, right? And a lot of times people say things because it's the language that they have available to them, because they want to say something, because they're responding. And I see it all the time in workshops and, other scenarios where people, like myself, you're speaking to find your thought, right? And so I try to lead people through conversations, exercises, however you want to say it, where we actually look at words and phrases that are used commonly, and I ask them to write their own definition of these things, right? And then they have discussion, and we put them into small groups and have discussion, and you can hear how people, something as simple as unconscious bias, or, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Words that we're hearing all the time and using all the time, but people have such a different orientation for these words, plus other words that are much more injurious and, and harmful. And so I think if you're asking, how do I personally go and work with communities to try to get them to unpack this stuff, you'd be, maybe amazed, I think, to see when people realize that there's actually a different or deeper meaning to something that they just didn't know, right? Or we try to also do work around, well, where did you first hear this? Or where did you first feel like you could give yourself permission to say this, right? What was the scenario? What was the context? What was happening? And does that align with who you say you are today? Does that reflect the value of how you believe you are? And I don't have actual stats. It's actually something that I want to work on, but it's a pretty high number of people who say, you know what? Yeah, I actually don't need to use that language. I don't want to say that. That's not actually what I mean. Or I'm just kidding, but I didn't realize the impact. My intention was different than the impact that it had on others. And we need to have more of that dialogue.
It's so interesting, because that's really the flip side of the social media that Jeffrey was talking about, where I know that when some of these pro ball players or rappers came out and said these things, which the Jewish community were like, taken aback by, the way they reached out was through social media. Somebody would slip into their DM on Twitter or Facebook and say, look, that I'm a friend of yours, and that doesn't sit right with me. So it's kind of that double-edged sword. It's the, social media taketh and giveth, or however you want to.
Also, social media has been used for some of these same people to share that they went through a process of understanding, right? Which I think is what you're speaking to, right? And they're able to then be, allies in a different way, and to be able to be an example of, I said this thing, I was told that this is actually not something I should be saying. It's not what I thought it meant. I get the impact. I'm not saying this happens with everyone, but some of those examples, or some of those people, are examples for that. And I think that we need to, to just be able to have more of those opportunities. And as a Jew of color, what people have said to me as recently as last week is still shocking, right? From other Jews, right? And so, again, I think it's so important for us to remember that just because we are stepping up for or standing up for others, it doesn't take away from the challenges that we face or the oppression that we face, but it is an opportunity for us to learn and to grow. And when it's time to talk about anti-Semitism and to have allies for to end anti-Semitism, we have those people there because, you know, we are not constantly centering ourselves when other people are talking about their own oppression.
There are a few of the questions, I think that was said so beautifully. A few of the questions go to this point, and I wanted to raise it. I don't know if this is Jeffrey or Ron or Serena or Gamal, whoever wants to take it, but is there enough allyship within the Jewish community? So many of the anti-Semitic attacks, I think it's 2/3 of the actual assaults nationwide. I'm assuming the statistics are similar for LA, I don't know, happen against the Orthodox community. And we certainly saw a lot of the vandalism and Jeffrey, you mentioned a couple incidences of assault that happened against Orthodox people because they're visibly Jewish. Is there enough allyship within the Jewish community, the majority of whom are not Orthodox, towards the Orthodox? Is there enough allyship between Jews of color and Ashkenazi Jews or Jews not of color, so that we could kind of deal with this together as a community? Is there enough allyship between liberal leaning Jews who may be to the far left on Israel and Jews who are to the far right of Israel, all of whom ultimately are going to pay a price for this? Who wants to take that?
I'll jump in.
Okay.
There's not enough allyship. There never is. And so one of the challenges is how we all really talk to each other and listen to each other. And within the Jewish community right now, one of the things you'll see is ADL, we've been around since 1913. We were founded after the lynching of a Jewish businessman. We've been fighting anti-Semitism since the start. Right now, with the increase in anti-Semitism and the incidents, and Rob, I'm not sure where that statistic comes from about the Orthodox. I'd be interested to learn more. Mm-hmm. But we're finding this time where, in a sense, everyone's making Shabbos at their own table. Everyone is fighting against anti-Semitism. And one of my concerns, frankly, is that with so many groups who are waging into this, that it's actually fracturing us. And the good news with ADL is we have critics on the left and the right. So we're right in the middle of that storm. But it is a concern of mine, because I really think right now, in this moment, we don't have the luxury of being divided. It's also the same thing with Jews of color. We all have to work together, 20%. ADL, we just launched a fellowship for Jews of color, because that's a community that we need to focus on more. But this is not the time to be divided. And so that's really what my message would be.
I'll jump, can I jump in, Rob?
Sure.
I just want to add, you know, it's a very Jewish concept. The idea of arguing for the sake of the heavens, right? It's what our sages have done since the beginning of time. And, you know, sometimes people say like 2 Jews, 3 opinions, 2 Jews, 9 opinions. I think that it is incumbent upon us as a community to be willing to have sacred arguments, to be willing to wrestle with one another, to be willing to disagree and not, you know, embrace this cancel culture, or to say, if this is your opinion, then, you know, you don't represent me and therefore you are an other. And that is happening too frequently. I think in the Jewish community, us not willing to talk to people outside our own echo chamber. And I'll just say that, you know, one of the things that the Jewish World Watch does, you know, we have these 3 pillars. We have education, advocacy, and empowerment projects. Our education starts by asking ourselves, what's the aperture through which we view the world, right? Where are we standing? And what does that mean for when we're talking to people who have a different aperture, and how can we see through their aperture? You know, how can we invite them into to view the world through our aperture so that we create a more equitable playing field and something that feels like a community that can move forward instead of continue to fracture more.
I'm going to jump in as well, real briefly. You know, rabbinical literature teaches that the first and second temples were destroyed because of what's known as sinat chinam, which in Hebrew means causeless hatred. Actually, causeless hatred that was between the Jews of that time that caused so many divisions. And I have seen in the last number of years increasing number of divisions among Jews themselves, because one is Republican and one is Democrat, because one is progressive and one is conservative, because one is a strong Zionist and one is not. And we have to learn to work with one another and to love one another for all of our foibles and for all of our flaws and for all of our differences. And it has to be more than just tolerating one another, be it within the Jewish community or in all of our communities. It has to be about how do we embrace each other and learn from each other and have, as Serena mentioned, sometimes very robust conversations. We don't always have to agree with one another, but I do think it's crucial that we as a Jewish community come together when it comes to understanding one another. And I think Reform need to understand Orthodox. Orthodox need to understand Reform and everything in between. That's how we can make a much a better job of countering anti-Semitism and hate generally.
I want to hop in here really quick as well. You know, it's a touch on what everybody said, and particularly what Jeff was bringing up, that the ADL has launched a initiative that, you know, is focused on engaging Jews of color. And this is something that is happening within a lot of Jewish organizations around the country. And in actuality, the Jews of color sort of movement, if you will, had been really percolating even before 2020, which we all know is when, you know, the killing of George Floyd happened, and a large portion of America, I don't mean this facetiously because it's literally happened, you know, sort of woke up one morning and realized, wow, I live in a racist country. And so, you know, and if this were a different panel, I would explain what I mean by woke up that morning and give you actual examples of texts and phone calls that I received from people around the country. But my point is that in the Jewish community, again, this is something that actually had already been starting to be, you know, to be grappling with. And then, of course, with what did happen more broadly outside of the Jewish community, with other organizations and institutions saying, I want to do something and I want to step up, there's been a very big increase in engaging Jews of color and really looking at some of the challenges that exist within the Jewish community, but also almost, you know, somewhere between 11 to 13% of the current Jewish community in America is multiracial, right? Are people of color in multiracial families. And that is really where the community, you know, and that's only increasing. And just really quickly, I would say that when people ask, why should we care about what's happening in terms of communities of color or in terms of the racial justice movement? And when Jews ask this question, my response often is, well, number one, Jews are also Black. Jews are also Asian, Latino, right? And these are, so if for no other reason, because you care about the Jewish community, and also a Jewish value that we do care about those outside of our community. And that's, you know, these are reasons why we want to not only invest in these kinds of initiatives, but we want to tell that story. And the Jews of color have been here. I've been Jewish my whole life. And I've, you know, and many people like me. So, you know, we've been here the whole time, but we've not been a part of the American Jewish story. And that's, again, going back to this communication challenge that I think we experience on multiple levels.
Yeah, it's so true that one big difference is there's so many overlapping identities. You know, people belong to multiple different identities and groups. And so it should make hate even more personal. It's never about one group. It always overlaps to a different group. But we have a lot of questions about schools, and that's kind of the broad category. So I want to try to formulate them kind of as one question. We saw a person in the student government at USC gets railroaded off because she was accused, or, you know, because she's pro-Israel. We saw various efforts of BDS at the school board level around California. We saw a fight over the ethnic studies curriculum. And then we see a lot of this BDS activity, anti-Israel activity on college campuses. So I guess a lot of the questions are, to what extent is that fomenting, either arising from anti-Semitism or fomenting anti-Semitism? And when, I know this is a huge question, this is a whole separate hour, but when does that cross the line from being critical of Israel to just being straight out anti-Semitic? It's a big one to take, and we're running out of time, so who wants it? Ron, why don't you start?
I'm going to start. Well, certainly we have seen this on college campuses for many years, and it has become worse and worse. It has been tolerated by administrations. It has been fomented by students. It has been fomented by outside organizations. We have to speak out against it. And I think that Jews on campus have to be strong in speaking out against it, as well as all of our allies. Now we're seeing it spread into other kinds of educational institutions. This year, UTLA, which is the union for LAUSD, supported. There were several committees that supported a resolution backing the BDS movement against Israel and calling for an end to all U.S. aid to Israel, urging the organization to endorse a cultural, economic, and academic embargo of the country. To me, this really crossed the line into anti-Semitism, because this has never been done for any other country. This kind of condemnation has never been lobbed against any others. But of course, it's perfectly acceptable to do it when it comes to Israel and Jews. And by the way, I would have to say, when you look at hatred of Israel, would people be hating Israel nearly as much if Israel was not a country of a lot of Jews? I doubt it. But of course, it is a very diverse country with all sorts of different religions and backgrounds and so much more. And I was one of those who really spoke up against what I saw happening from certain activists within UTLA. Thankfully, others spoke up as well and managed, at least for now, to kill that resolution. But let's be honest, it's going to come back. And it's coming back in schools all over the country. And we have to be really proactive to fight it, and fight it vociferously.
Jeff, do you have a quick kind of formula on when kind of honest, sincere criticism of Israel, justified criticism of Israel, bends over towards anti-Semitism?
There's no quick silver bullet for anything. So everything is contextual. And what I would say real quickly about education is, first and foremost, it's always about the student. Whether it's an elementary school, a high school, college, that's the first thing. And then overall, I think you need to have an inside and outside strategy. And Rob, I think this gets to your question. On the inside, for example, ADL, we're working within school districts. We're working on college campuses with Hillels, with the administration, but there are times, and that's often the most effective way, where you have the relationship. But there are times, like Ron mentions with UTLA, where you need to be very loud and very vocal. And so it's all context, and there's a time for each, but everything doesn't require or merit the same approach. You got to look at the context.
Mm-hmm. Ron, you've been in this for many years. You've been involved in city government, and you've seen hate up, down, spike. You've seen a lot. You've been through a lot of different hate incidents in LA. People say education. We need education. What policies do you see as having worked, as having reduced the amount of anti-Semitic crimes or hate crimes in LA? What do you think works?
Well, I think education is important, but we have to define what that education is and what we mean by it. Nazi Germany was arguably one of the most educated countries in the world at the time of the Holocaust. And look at the horror that ensued. We also think of our universities as the greatest center of learning and education in our nation. And yet that is where we see so much anti-Semitism that unfortunately is fomenting, not to mention discrimination against a whole bunch of other folks as well. So I think we have to look at what we mean by education. And by the way, ADL and Jeffrey, you have been really leaders in helping to come up with some interesting and creative ways to help engage people. But I know for myself, one of the things I love about being a citywide official, and by the way, interestingly enough, all 3 citywide elected officials in the city of Los Angeles happen to be Jewish. And I will also say gratefully that when we ran for office, it wasn't really an issue. People were interested in what are you going to do to make local government better, which is what elections ought to be about on the local level. But what I love about the job that I have is that I am part of so many different communities, and you get to know people and to embrace them and to have them embrace you and to understand what their issues and what their challenges and what their concerns and what their fears are. And it is by having those relationships on an institutional level, but also on a one-to-one level, that we can really educate one another and learn from one another. And that's a process that is ongoing. It's not a destination, it's a journey.
Yeah, breaking down those barriers despite all this diversity we've been talking about and really connecting with people. We're running up against 6 o'clock, so I wanted to ask each of you for a final comment. And I wanted, I guess if there's a final question, it would be, what gives you hope? What makes you think that we're going to be able to attack and address this problem in a constructive way? Serena, why don't you start?
Thanks. Well, first of all, as we're closing, I want to say thank you to everybody for this. It's what feels like a really robust conversation, and I hope that we can all continue to talk. What gives me hope is really is the allyship. Right? It's definitely important to educate ourselves. It's important. We're seeing the governor and Senator Stern work on a genocide education bill, and Jewish World Watch made sure that it wasn't just Jewish people at the table, but we wanted to make sure that the Armenian community was at the table and the Uyghur community. To see many communities from a variety of persecuted backgrounds coming together and standing and saying, this story is my story, whether it's about the Jewish community, whether it's about, the Armenian community, the Uyghur community, that's what gives us hope. I mean, it's small victories, and it's knowing that we do have people standing together with us, that we aren't alone in this fight.
Gamal?
What gives me hope is what's happening right now on, sometimes I call it the referendum on identity. And particularly when you talk to Gen Z folks and, and other people, I mean, we are asking questions about identity in ways that I don't believe have happened before, and on a global level, not just here in America, whether it's about pronouns and gender, or whether it's about how we have relationships and, and who our partners are, and how we should conduct ourselves inside of relationships, how we can have multiple identities, right? Where you don't have to choose. I mean, we're at a time right now, which I think is a part of also the tension point, where everything that we sort of know about what it means to be whoever we think we are is actually being tested and questioned. And that gives me great hope.
It's beautiful. Jeffrey. You'll get it.
Last evening on 60 Minutes, Scott Pelley asked Andrew Sullivan, the writer and commentator, the same question. And I thought it was amazing what he said. He said, hope's a sense that grace can happen. You never know what's around the corner. Maybe there'll be some time in the future, a leader, a figure, or there must be some sort of groundswell of people saying, enough of this, enough of this. The noise, the rage, it's deafening, and we're better than this. And what gives me hope is I know we're all better than this. As Americans, Californians, Los Angelinos, we're better than this. Enough of this. And there's enough of us, and thank you for this forum tonight. There's enough of all of us of good grace that we can make a difference. And that gives me hope.
Ron, you're going to have the last word here.
I would say it is my children and the world that they are going to be growing up in that give me hope. my husband, who's a rabbi, and I, we have twins who are just a little more than 2 years old, and they started preschool. And they're in a Jewish preschool, not to advertise for my husband's synagogue, but a wonderful preschool. And in that, they have classmates who are Jewish and Black, who are Jewish and Latino, who are Jewish and Asian, who are from parents who are LGBTQ. And they have classmates that are learning all sorts of different languages from their parents. And all sorts of different traditions and backgrounds. And that's the world that they're going to grow up in and learn to embrace. And that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of promise for the future. And I believe that we can change the world and we can make the world a better place. And our calling as human beings and our callings as Jews is tikkun olam, to, as it were, repair the world. And in each generation, there's a lot of repair work to do. And we've come together, and I believe that we can do it, and to create a better world for the next generation and the generation after that.
Thank you.
Amen.
Well, amen. This last hour gave me hope. So I really want to thank you, Controller Galperin, for pulling us all together. I want to thank your office, Renita and Ian and everybody there. I want to thank the Forward, Gabby, for anchoring this. And I want to thank the panelists who've done just enlightened me to no end. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. So I'm sure there'll be more conversations, more with the Controller, definitely more with the Forward, forward.com. Check it out. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.